So welcome everybody to this episode of the Discover series. My name is Angela Unk and I'm Director of Development at the Clements Library. Today's meeting is being recorded to share online. And this afternoon or maybe tomorrow morning, you'll receive an email with the recording and resources mentioned during today's broadcast. If this is your first time joining the Clements Library for a program, you also might like to check out our website. We have many of our previous programs recorded there. So you can see previous Discover series, as well as lectures and our bookworm episodes. If this is your first time using Zoom, I also want to point out a couple of things that might make your experience better. We encourage you to chat with us in the chat. So I see many people have already found that, so thank you very much. It'd be great if you can select all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comments. And you'll notice that the conversation goes by very quickly. So because of that, we ask you, if you have questions for Jayne, to please put them in the Q&A section. You'll find that in the bar. If you're on a desktop or laptop, it's likely along the bottom or the top, but look around for that as well. There you can ask your questions so that they all stay together. You can also upvote other people's questions. So if it's something you especially would like answered, please give it a thumbs up and that will help sort it. And the answers are posted with the questions if we type things in, and you are welcome to comment on those questions as well. And we look forward to seeing your questions today. I can only control so much of what you see on Zoom, so we do have it in side-by-side mode, so you might notice that you can see both the slides that I'm sharing and me as a speaker, and there should be a line dividing the two. If you take your mouse, you can drag that line to change how much you see. So play around with that a little bit so that you can get it to a point that you enjoy. As part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion initiative, I do have the live transcript turned on today. If you find that distracting and don't need it, you can toggle it off by clicking on live transcript. You can also change the size of the font if you are enjoying having that option and would like it a little bit bigger. Okay, I think that's most of the Zoom things. This program today is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. The Clements Library enables the discovery, learning, and teaching of American history through the collection, conservation, digitization, and availability of primary sources on paper. So I'm going to take a moment to close our poll and share with you the results. And my initial, I initially went back and forth, debated, but I was really thinking washing machine. And if you signed on early, you heard me talking about the washing machine that my grandmother had used when she was first married, that was still in their basement when I was a kid. But 71% said that of those four, they would choose the washing machine. So thank you for participating in that poll today. All right. I am pleased to introduce Jayne Ptolemy, Assistant Curator of Manuscripts at the Clements Library, who originally conceived of today's topic as an exhibit in conjunction with the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. As the pandemic wore on, it became less likely that the Clements would reopen for exhibit viewing in 2020. I am delighted that Jayne was able to repurpose her research into this wonderful Discover series to share with all of you. Jayne received her BA from Albion College in 2006 with a major in history and a concentration in ethnic studies. In 2013, she graduated from Yale University with a dual PhD in history and African American studies. Jayne, thanks so much for putting this together today, and I'll let you take it away.
Okay, let me just share my screen, so bear with me as I get this going. Great. Okay. So I just want to say at first that these past few months have kind of been just one long lesson in being flexible and looking for new ways to do our work. When shelter-in-place orders were first instituted in Michigan, we were just weeks away from installing an exhibit in plain sight looking for women's history in the archive. Realizing, as Angela said, that an in-person exhibit would no longer make sense, we instead re-envisioned how we might still engage our communities with the same ideas in a virtual format. So I'm excited now to be having a series of conversations in the next few weeks to highlight some of the thinking on this topic, showcase some of our wonderful holdings, and embrace the silver lining that I now get to engage in more expansive dialogue in this online format than I otherwise would have been afforded. So thank you for being a part of this with me. As Angela noted, the exhibit that almost was, and these talks were inspired by the centennial of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which afforded women the constitutional right to vote in the United States. That story, of course, began far earlier than 1920, and it has continued throughout the century that followed as the struggle to live in freedom, equality, and citizenship continues each and every day. And that long and continuing history of women's rights is an inspiring one filled with bold women fighting to change the status quo, to have their voices heard, to shape the world around them. And yet I've always shied away from studying the movement, somehow failing to get sparked by the story. I will sheepishly admit that when I was first tasked with working on an exhibit around the centennial of the 19th Amendment, I kind of dreaded it. I'm politically informed. I identify as a feminist. I get excited and enraged by national and local politics, and I exercise the right to vote that those suffragettes struggled so hard to secure for women like me. And yet it was still hard for me to dive into the history. So sitting there trying to wrangle my guilt and find my inspiration, I realized that it was because my mind kind of automatically conjured the big names. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And my imagination was dominated by visions of privileged white women in tightly buttoned dresses speaking at rallies. And I know that image is unfair and not the whole story. But the description of the movement's leaders in the hefty multi-volume History of Women's Suffrage, published between 1881 and 1922 by Stanton, Anthony, among others, kind of deliberately set up that framework from the very beginning, and it's still really hard to escape. The leaders there are noted as women of superior mental and physical organization, of good social standing and education, remarkable alike for their domestic virtues, knowledge of public affairs, and rare executive ability, good speakers and writers, inspiring and conducting the genuine reforms of the day. Talk about high standards. As rousing as those revered leaders are, and as much as I personally owe to them, I don't necessarily identify with them. I'm a working mom, and I count my week pretty successful if I manage to get my hours in, not burn supper too badly, and sometimes, occasionally, sweep the cracker crumbs off my kitchen floor. It's unlikely that I will ever lead a social revolution. I am decidedly unremarkable in my domestic virtues. My mental and physical organization are dubious at best these days. And so it's hard for me to project myself backward in time and to explore that history when it feels so distant from my own experience. Which got me thinking about those women in the past whose lives and inclinations might have been a little bit closer to mine. How do we find their stories, think about their connections to these broader historical moments, and consider how their inclusion shifts our perspective? I've been incredibly fortunate to work at the Clements for about 7 years now, and I'm continuously finding beautiful moments in the archive that speak to all kinds of women's history, from luminaries and rule breakers to everyday women. But sometimes you also come across something that gives you pause and makes you wonder about everything you're not seeing. The past few months, I've spent a lot of time musing on a genre of photography that my colleagues in the Clements Library's graphics division introduced me to, informally called hidden mother photographs. In the mid to late 19th century, camera exposure times were much longer than they are today. And to keep a young child still long enough to capture a clear image, adults would sometimes help hold them. To keep the focus on the subject of the portrait, the adult could be draped in fabric, leaving us with these really evocative photos where spectral figures kind of haunt the image, or draped hands grasp the child. Or sometimes you might notice a face kind of peeking out at the margin, hands reaching out from behind chairs, offering support and comfort. And once you start looking, you begin to find more and more of them. Your eye trained to focus on the background whenever you see a picture of a baby. In our expansive David B. Tinder collection of Michigan photography, from which these past examples were pulled, browsing box after box after box, you'll find these hidden mothers. In our Richard Port collection of Native American photography, a mother's hand reaches quietly into the frame. In Arabella Chapman's photograph albums documenting her African American family in 19th century Albany, you glimpse a mother crouching behind the chair, her head peeking out here and her arms extending out in an embrace. I'm fascinated by these moments where women deliberately hid themselves, quite literally marginalizing themselves in the record. And yet, even while doing so, their relationship to the child is still at the heart of the image, obscured by a drape, reaching into the frame, hiding behind a prop. Their presence still functions to ground the child. Their relationship is what makes the photograph possible. And it's really easy to think of these as historical oddities born of the photographic medium of the times. But I'm guilty of the same practice, and I bet you know somebody else who is too. When my son was 6 months old, a friend sent him a cute shirt, and I wanted to show him wearing it to say thank you. Still in my pajamas, my hair unbrushed, tired from half a year of broken sleep, I purposely hid myself behind him. And yet, you see my hands. You know I was holding him. I dressed him, made sure he was happy. I orchestrated the photo. I sent it. I saved it. I'm at the heart of all of it. And yet I was compelled to hide, thinking that no one would see me. Even the very fact that the genre is colloquially known as hidden mother photographs is really telling, because the record shows it's not always women hiding. A joyous father is shown here. Sometimes you see lapels or dress or suits and pants that belie the name, and yet it still persists. I think in part because when we see a hidden figure draped behind a fabric kind of hiding themselves, our own gendered expectations help us read that as a woman. And so I turn to these photographs where we often know quite literally nothing about the figure behind the drape as a framing device for this exhibit. Who were you? Why is it so hard to find you? How can we include your stories even if you are hidden, even if you hid yourself? Of course, it's not always so obvious how women are cloaked within archival collections. Sometimes it just takes a commitment to looking closer, working harder, and challenging our presumptions in order to uncover their presence. So I'm going to think through a couple examples with you. This is a 17th century Catholic confessional manual published by Paula de Benavides, the widow, La Viuda, of established publisher Bernardo de Calderon. Paula likely learned the printing trade by working with her husband in Mexico City. Upon Bernardo's death in 1640, he left the workshop and bookstore to Paula, which she used profitably to support herself and her 6 children. While some widows in this period would rent or sell their presses to make money, Paula stood at the helm of this business for 43 years, actively printing all the while. The familial nature of trades like publishing meant that women's participation was acceptable, if not widespread. Here, just taking note of that one word, widow, la viuda. Just here, and it's just mentioned once in the imprint, opens up a whole new story that centers women. And it's a story that spans centuries. We have a wonderful volume entitled A Set of Plans and Forts in America, reduced from actual surveys. British engraver and mapmaker John Rock produced this set of 30 maps, published in 1763, illustrating some of the key areas of British rule in America on the heels of the French and Indian War. Problem is, John Rock died in 1762. This volume was ushered into being by his widow, Mary Ann Rock. In this 1763 edition, she shows up just once on the bottom of the edge of the plan of the city of New York as M.A. Rock. So there's this long tradition of widows stepping into their husband's work, kind of challenging any pat assumptions we have of women's limitation just to the domestic realm. Under the mantle of supporting their family following the male head's death, they carried on the business and hint at their deeper involvement during all the previous years. They didn't enter completely blind. But if we approach this map with no prior knowledge of John or Mary Ann Rock or the complicated space of widowhood, all we see is the initial at the bottom of the page. Only if we don't presume M.A. is a man do we open up the space to find and explore these moments. And in the library, initials are everywhere. Take this intricate cloth binding of the 1897 social life in Old Virginia before the war. In the bottom corner, right here, you'll see a small M.A. blown up here. Be curious about who is hiding behind the initials. Here is Margaret Armstrong, a talented cover designer operating in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, producing some 270 covers. These examples are pulled from the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. And I just wanted to include them because I pine over them. They're gorgeous. And you'll see again, just in this tiny little tiny initials that kind of hint at her. And if you know what they are, they mean a lot. So I really encourage you to look a little bit more at Margaret Armstrong's work, just as something to drool over. But of course, sometimes even initials are a luxury. There are lots of anonymous sources in the library, and some of them are produced by women. This is an unsigned map of the Great Lakes in Ohio from about 1800. Its creator isn't definitively known, but it's suspected to have been drawn by Elizabeth Simcoe, who accompanied her husband John Graves Simcoe to Ontario when he became the first Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada in the 1790s. So I take this map kind of as a call, even when looking at genres dominated by men like cartography or the military or government, to not rule out women's presence and active contributions. But the challenge isn't just in being open to the possibility that initials or anonymous could indicate a woman. Even when the women are identified by name, it can still be really hard to seek them out in the library catalog. Here are the records for the maps Mary Ann Rock published in 1763, as well as the book Mary Armstrong helped design in 1897. Note that neither of them in the record include the words woman or women. And it's the same for Elizabeth Simcoe's map, both in the catalog record for the map itself and the finding aid for the broader John Graves Simcoe papers. They both note her believed authorship, but neither include broader terms like woman. And there's a whole host of reasons why that is. But the underlying result is that if you're generally interested in researching women's contributions to cartography or cover design or something else, how do you find them if you don't already know their names? Researchers of women's history can attest that it's long, hard work, cross-referencing bibliographies, combing through catalog records for any hints, and just hunting and hunting and hunting. So not only are the women obscured by anonymity or initials, but they can also be a little buried by the library cataloging standards, even when those initials have been cracked open to reveal their identity. And as a shameless plug, if you're interested in hearing more about these ways that women have helped build libraries and archives, be sure to join us in 2 weeks when we'll be thinking more about these types of questions. So in many ways, what this project is, and I'm talking about today, is a call for us to turn our eye to those moments of obfuscation, whether hidden behind draping, initials, anonymity, cataloging standards. What does it take to look for these women and uncover their stories? And sometimes the stories are right in front of us, just in ways that don't make for a big splashy moment. And so sometimes they can be left untold. I think a lot about a letter in our Marcus Jameson papers, written by a woman in 1879, where she laments her status of being in a perpetual state of dishwashing. It's a beautiful turn of phrase, and it's one I think about every night when I'm doing my own dishes. But here she draws herself standing before that mountain of dishes with the statement underlined thrice, "Here I are." When we think about the women's rights movement or the struggle for suffrage, how often do we think about how much time it took to do the dishes, to cook dinner? What were the barriers to women's participation? What other pulls were there on their energy? Who did they most impact? Indeed, this letter is so striking to me because the writer found herself in this position before the pile of dishes because her usual hired help was away, leaving the brunt of the work on her shoulders. Women's domestic labor and the class and race structure that shifted some of that burden onto the underprivileged is really key to looking for all kinds of women, to see them where they were. And politics absolutely entered the kitchen in all kinds of interesting ways. We'll be chatting next week a little bit more about reading cookbooks and recipes, looking for politics and the rich history of women that can be gleaned by taking the kitchen as a vitally important theme. I hope you'll join us for that as well. But it's not just the kitchen that can help us draw out everyday experiences of women and explore their relevance to broader movements. Clothing is another example of a source that holds so much research potential if you go looking for it. And there are certainly moments where clothing directly resonates with political movements of the day, like spinning bees in the 1760s and 1770s, which aided the boycott of British goods by producing homespun cloth. Or a century later, when Confederate women worked to produce cloth and sew uniforms to clothe soldiers during the Civil War, as represented here in a reprint of an 1860s pro-Confederate etching. A century apart and spurred by dramatically different conflicts, but in both, women's domestic production undergirded the broader social upheaval and was used as a propaganda tool. As important as those moments were, what I'm personally interested in is the day-to-day interactions with clothing and what they can tell us. Reading women's correspondence, sometimes you'll stumble over small scraps of fabric as they write to each other about the clothing they were sewing or having made, showing the textiles they were using or thinking about. These examples are from letters written in 1876 in our Brownell family papers. And you can see on the left a really wonderful little pen and ink illustration of the dress, as well as swatches of the fabric. I find these to be really beautiful archival moments that not only give us a great look at the material culture of the period, but also highlight the function of clothing as a component of community building. Women separated by space that's hard for us to understand in the age of Zoom and email and smartphones, bridged the divide between them by grounding their letters in these mundane details. Working together to think about a dress, debating the particulars, silk or not, helped keep them connected. And the fabric can be gorgeous. It can be easy to think of the past in black and white, dour expressions in a grayscale daguerreotype, but the fabrics you find in the archive can point to a lot of personality. Nestled in the 1851 Hunt's Family Almanac, for example, there's an exquisite clipping of cloth that I just love. We don't know how it was used or why it was inserted into this almanac, but its vibrancy is a nice reminder that the 19th century happened in color. And altered photographs also suggest the way people hearken to bright tones. Whether these women actually wore that loud shade of blue or purple, I can't say, but someone clearly imagined the figures in that palette. So clothes have always been a form of self-expression and community identity. One item that speaks to this, and also happens to be one of my favorite objects in the library, is a small silk purse. The Clements faithfully cares for the family papers of Angelina and Sarah Grimke, two leading white 19th century abolitionists. In 1838, Angelina Grimke married fellow abolitionist Theodore Weld, and it's believed that she used this purse during their wedding. Hand-painted with anti-slavery imagery, one side featuring a kneeling enslaved woman in the style of the "Am I Not a Woman and a Sister" iconography, and the other showing a woman leaning over her infant child. Together, they squarely locate Black womanhood and the violence of slavery at the heart of Angelina Grimke's wedding ceremony. The fact that the purse is constructed of silk is also worth considering. It could be simple as a luxury, using a beautiful fabric during an important life event, but it may also hearken to the growing free produce movement that boycotted the use of products reliant on slave labor in the 19th century, including cotton. So one article of clothing points to a lot of opportunities to explore not just Angelina Grimke's personal relationship to the anti-slavery movement, but also abolitionism's complicated use of gender in the struggle against slavery. There are so many moments like this where thinking about one piece of clothing or one type of clothing can unravel all kinds of insights about women's broader roles and experiences. The mid-19th century bloomers are an especially rich example. It was a short-lived fashion phenomenon born of frustration about the physical constraints of women's restrictive dresses, as well as anxieties about the health impacts of tight corsets and heavy petticoats. Bloomers, named after Amelia Bloomer, who didn't invent the trend but did help popularize it in her serial The Lily, consisted of a jacket, a skirt that hit just below the knees, and a pair of trousers. It was short-lived, just spanning a few years after it first appeared in the early 1850s, but it made a big impact. It was certainly a curiosity. Illustrated sheet music featured the outfit. The Bloomer Waltz, the new costume polka, and more show just how widespread the public interest was in the idea. Be sure to check out the recording of our recent conversation with sheet music collector Kevin Hugh Lynch, where he talks more about a number of fabulous women's rights pieces to think about that connection between women's dress reform and popular culture. But unsurprisingly, bloomers also drew a lot of backlash. This 1851 print, Bloomerism in Practice, Morning After the Victory, is a satirical feat. It reads at the bottom, Mrs. Turkey reposing on her laurels waiting for breakfast, Mr. Turkey mending his coat tail. Enters Master Turkey crying, "Oh, Ma, breakfast will never be ready, for Biddy says she wants to do like Mrs. and won't cook anymore," says she. First disappointment. Looking closely, you'll see a framed print in the upper corner from a women's rights convention that the unladylike smoke cloud over Mrs. Turkey head reveals her dreams of the presidency, that the servants, both Black and white, have been out protesting no more basement and kitchen, no more massa and misses. And the young boy bemoans in the corner with his sad sign, no more Papa and Mama. This domestic upheaval centers around clothing. Mrs. Turkey's bloomers, certainly, but also Mr. Turkey's decline into now having to mend his own coattails. You'll note him here sitting with needle in hand. Linking women's rights, women's clothing reform, and the seeming threat to household norms, this print highlights the potency of clothing to speak to a wide host of social issues and anxieties. Just think of the commentary about Hillary Clinton's pantsuits, and I think it becomes clear that the linkage between women's empowerment and their fashion choices, especially their pants, hasn't abated even 150 years later. And of course, fashion was and continues to be steeped in privilege. In the 1820s, artist Edward Clay produced a series of 14 satirical prints entitled Life in Philadelphia, which included pointed visual reckonings with free Black society in the North. Lampooning African-American elites, his representations dismissed Black uplift and the early American Republic as laughable. In this print, which was published in London, Mr. Caesar asks how Miss Chloe finds the weather on a hot, humid, likely mid-Atlantic day. Bedecked in the finest fashion, she answers, "Pretty well, I thank you, Mr. Caesar, only I aspire too much." The tongue-in-cheek slippage between perspire and aspire underscores what Clay suggests is the dual impracticality of her fashion, both in terms of daily use and its broader social implications. Whether you pushed for fashion reforms like the Bloomerites in the 1850s, or even if you just tried to adopt the popular dress of the day like elite free Blacks in the 1820s, satirical jabs focusing on clothing could be a political tool striking against women's place in society. Don't aspire too much. So when you're thinking about women's history, to do it seriously, sometimes it just means having to tend to the social norms they inhabited, even if the figures you study are best known for trying to deconstruct them. The paradigm of the separate spheres, women and the domestic, men in the public, has always been somewhat fluid and certainly variable across generations. But still, attesting to the demands that women invariably faced in the home is still important. This 1848 lithograph, The Life and Age of Women, printed in the same year as the first Seneca Rights Convention, shows the various stages imagined for a middle-class white woman, squarely framed in her role as daughter, wife, and mother. Each image is coupled with a verse. Her girlish pastimes next for show, the cares which women's life must know. It reads under the image of a young girl cradling a doll. Absorbed in household duties now, the weight of toil contracts her brow. As we've touched on already, cooking and clothing point to all sorts of inroads about exploring broader stories. And so does looking for moments that point to the historical realities of housekeeping and child rearing. And when you start looking, you find little kids everywhere. These precious cutouts of newborn Mildred Smith's hands were enclosed in letters as a way for relatives to connect to the new family member in the 1890s. They evoke the little hands that grasp at mother's hair, at their pens as they write, at their dress hems. As researchers and observers from another era, these small hands to me serve as reminders of the children who filled the home, sat on the laps, and touched every aspect of a mother's life as she confronted the demands and challenges of her time. And when you read women's letters and focus on what they say about their daily lives, you get really powerful testaments about parenting. You read of antics familiar to anyone with young children. Kids barking like dogs, spinning across the floor and mixing bowls, climbing on tables, running inconvenient fevers. You hear women tell of having to put their pens down to stop the mischief, lamenting how hard it is to concentrate for all the noise. And sometimes you see evidence of the children themselves in some of my favorite pieces, interrupted letters. In this letter from our Hill family papers, Alice Hill writes in 1864 about her young children, Isabel and Crawford. Crawford, a toddler, is bothering me almost to death. And then the writing gets just a little bit sloppier. Dear Papa, I want to see you. I love you dearly. Which Alice explains was written by Crawford. I held his hand. The scene is so vivid to me, and one I feel deep in my bones, having been working from home with a 3.5-year-old. A mother trying to write a letter with her children nearby finds herself unable to keep them distracted and ends up incorporating them into her work. As I read about all kinds of inspiring women's stories, I often quietly think to myself, were there kids around? Because it alters fundamentally the shape and demands of any kind of work they were doing, and it's a story worth telling. How is your time and attention divided? It doesn't diminish our sense of women's accomplishments to acknowledge and account for what happens within the home. Quite the opposite. And to be quite frank, it's just really fun to look for kids in the collections. The Clements' collection of juvenile books includes great examples of their readership. This smear of color here on the face in this 1816 illustrated children's book, My Mother, a Poem by a Lady, speaks at perhaps hints at the possible hand of a possible child, or maybe just a really bad colorist. But the pencil edition at the top of the page, My Mother, certainly indicates a young reader actively engaging with the text. Who ran to help me when I fell, and would some pretty story tell, or kiss the place to make it well, my mother. I love that that's the page they chose to include their block letter tribute to their own mother, because tending to injuries, the emotional demands of motherhood, that takes time and energy. This dramatic tear in the title page of our 1790 copy of Hagar in the Desert, translated from the French for the use of children, certainly points to signs of use. I know quite a few books in my personal library include torn pages and bite marks. But for me, it's the hand-stitched repairs to the page that I find so lovely, evoking the care likely taken by a mother or other female relative attending to the rough handling of young hands. The physical materiality of the objects in the collection, not just the text, the printed text, provides small glimpses into the everyday demands of family life. Another example of the materiality of the item that I want to point out comes from the 1833 Fruits of Philosophy, or the Private Companion of Young Married People, which includes advice about reproduction. And I just love this moment in the margin where you see an ink thumbprint that nods to the volume's active use. Children are such a huge part of a family's experience, especially women's. It's kind of looking for these archival moments where we can acknowledge how central and time-consuming childbearing and rearing was for women, to look for how people actively thought about birth control and family planning, can help us to better frame the challenges and successes we see outside the home. The two can't be severed. And of course, it's also vital to remember that for all of the work and interruptions attendant upon mothering, it's also a deep privilege. This 1853 bill of sale really sits heavily with me, as all documents of the slave trade do. But this one is for the sale of David Crockett, age about 3 years, for $300. And nowhere on the page is there any mention of his mother, 3 years old. For all of those archival moments of joy and chaos and torn pages and little hands, there's also a flip side where those moments were so tenuous, undocumented, and at the mercy of brutality. I think a lot about this hidden mother in particular, hidden not by a drape in a photographer's studio, but by the silences of the documentary record that replicate how casually white supremacy overlooked her humanity as a mother to a child. Don't let those silences go unnoticed. It's important to open up space, to try and speak back, to interrogate what little evidence does appear. This daguerreotype of Egbert Handy sleeping in the arms of Sarah in 1858 always makes my breath catch, no matter how often I see it. Something about her averted gaze and the inherent tenderness of holding a sleeping baby, paired with the attached note that reads, Egbert Gillis Handy in arms of Sarah, a slave given to Mary Jane Purnell as a wedding gift by her father. Sarah raised all of Dr. Handy's 10 children, of whom Egbert Gillis was number 7. Sarah remained a loved member of the family until her marriage late in life. A loved member of the family, but a wedding gift? What was Sarah's experience with motherhood, raising 10 white children, but likely at the expense of her own family? I wonder about her, marrying late in life. Did she have children of her own? Did she want them? Moments that help us not just think about, but viscerally feel these questions of who is doing the labor and at what cost are important to the bigger questions of how women inhabited their world and envisioned how to change it. And these questions apply even when you look at the straightforward suffrage activities. The Clements holds 2 volumes of Emma Catherine Brown's diaries, written in the 1890s. A young Quaker woman from the mid-Atlantic, many of her entries relate to the weather and social visits, but she was also actively attending temperance and suffrage meetings. The typical entry just reads, "I washed a 2-week wash and did most of the ironing and then went to a suffrage meeting." In her entry from March 9th, 1896, how many games of parcheesi she won, 3, holds as much weight as her suffrage activities. In the evening, we attended an equal suffrage entertainment. Activism always has to fit into your daily life, and attesting to that linkage between reform and a woman's domestic realities can help us see women who advocated for change as 3-dimensional people, attending a suffrage rally, but also, playing some parcheesi. All of these questions about how we uncover these stories of women's lived realities, diverse and complicated, and sometimes just largely filled with the day-to-day tasks of making your way through the week, have bearing as we think about 1920 and the 19th Amendment. What was the context in which women organized? How was the movement built, and in what stolen moments? How did people react to the call for women's suffrage, and why? This 1914 musical comedy, Suffragettes, kind of hit me over the head with all of these questions in one really evocative scene featuring the children of suffragette demonstrators. "Tell me, what would you do if this happened to you? Mothers marching along the street, not a bite in the house to eat. Come now, what would you say if she left you all day?" The stage directions at the bottom have the children pointing to tears in their sleeves. Does it remind you of that anti-bloomerism print? The child lamenting no more mama and papa? Women's ambitions destroying the home? Empty larders, holes in clothes, motherless children, food, clothes, child rearing. These daily tasks absolutely occupied women's time and attention, and the social backlash when they dared to ask for a political voice threw it back in their faces time and again. So take it seriously. Why were those the flashpoints? What were women's actual experiences with them? How did that shape their calls for justice, their ability to engage with the movement demanding it, and how they may have been excluded from what was subsequently achieved? When I was an undergrad, one of my favorite shirts was emblazoned with the ever-popular feminist slogan, "Well-behaved women seldom make history." At the time, I, as many do, took it as an empowering message to look for and step outside of gender restrictions, to reject expectations that would dampen my voice and impact, to make my mark by going big. This tote bag from the New York Historical Society, advertised as the perfect accessory for strong women with an urge to succeed, positions suffragettes next to the slogan and kind of reinforces that idea that those that push against the norms are the ones to make the history books. But now, many moons later, with quite a few more gray hairs, with responsibilities that keep my expectations more modest, and my behavior mostly well-behaved, that reading of the message instead feels disheartening and alienating. If my days are spent doing my job, cooking supper, cleaning up messes, throwing in a load of laundry, tending to children and households and bills, do I not make history? Does my history not count? As it turns out, the phrase was coined by feminist historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich in the 1970s to make that exact point, that it does, that well-behaved women may make history, not because their stories don't matter, but because the field hadn't turned its attention to those quieter moments enough. The point is not that only those women who go big, who rally and hold office, who pioneer, who break rules, are the ones that shape history. Just that we collectively fail to see how other women's influence our history as well. So look again. It takes a lot of time, a good dose of creativity, and a heck of a lot of patience, but their stories are there and they matter. You don't have to be a Susan B. Anthony. We can't all be a Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Be inspired by them, but don't forget that you make a difference in your own circle of influence. Your history matters, even in the day-to-day, even if it's a little hidden. So do what you can. Make sure you're in the picture, even if you're a little hidden. And if you love an archivist, even if you just kind of like us, label it and use more than just your initials. And please, to honor all the women we thought about today, this November, get out and vote. So I'm happy now to kind of turn it over and think about what kind of questions everybody has.
Thank you, Jayne. That was amazing. I'll just remind everybody to put your questions in the Q&A section. That would be great. And I also would like to mention, thank you so much for joining us today. As Jayne mentioned earlier, this is a 3-part series. So now that you are signed up, you do not need to sign up again. You'll get a reminder next week reminding you to join us again. And if you are unable to join us, we will send the link of the recording out to you. So let's see. Tracy's asking, can you think of examples in the Clements Library collection where the voices of illiterate or semi-literate women come through?
Yeah, you know, it's hard, but there are moments where you see it. The one that always comes to mind, we have one letter in our Show Civil War collection where it's a white Union soldier writing home, and he's writing about this moment where he transcribed a letter from an enslaved man who escaped, and he's writing to break his engagement with a woman. And so it's almost like you have to read twice, where the letter is being is being transcribed from the African American man to the Union soldier, and then from there you have to think about the woman's response and like how she would have responded to that. So sometimes it can be kind of doubly hidden or read through multiple lenses and multiple layers in order to try to get to their experience. You know, a lot of times if you see travel letters or travel narratives, people will be talking about the things that they see and the people that they talk to. And so again, you don't get that primary source of that person themselves telling you their experience, but you can see it through somebody else's eyes. And so that experience that we then have to do is think about how that's being measured and how that's being translated, and what kind of prejudices are shaping how they're describing that moment. But sometimes if you just think concretely, that person was there on that street doing that thing, you can kind of get to that experience just a little bit. So, you know, it takes a lot of care, it takes a lot of caution, it takes a good deal of imagination and piecing things together, but there are ways to, I think, try to get to those experiences.
Thank you. All right, let's see. Elise is asking, are these personal treasures such as the little hands, letters, etc., in the Clements, and how are such personal items acquired?
Yeah, so everything from the presentation today, the collection items are from the Clements, minus the Margaret Armstrong bindings, which I wish were in our collection, but they're not. So yeah, those little hands are absolutely part of the Brunel family papers. And stuff comes in many different ways. Either families donate them to us, trying to care for the legacy of their family to make sure they're well preserved and that the researchers can access them to interpret the past. But we also buy things on the open market, just through dealers and auctions and whatnot. You know, the Clements, I find, is such a beautiful research institution because our focus is so broad on the American experience that Mildred Smith's, you know, 6-week-old little hand cutout is as valuable and important to us as the letter from Abraham Lincoln, because both of those give you that moment to try to explore the past, to imagine that moment and think about those questions. That one isn't necessarily, one might be worth more money, but they're both hold the research value. And so they kind of sit side by side in the vault as the treasures, just depending on how you look at them.
Thank you. Betty is asking, any materials in the Clements about efforts of Native American women to get the vote, or letters or documents about African American women and their involvement in the suffrage movement?
Yeah, you know, not that I know of, but it doesn't mean they're not there. But not that I know of. The Clements is much stronger in the earlier time frame. So we have some great stuff from the 1870s to the 1890s, like of women, those early stages of struggling for suffrage writ large. But because our collecting focus is really pre-1900, we don't have a lot of stuff from like the 19 teens. So we're a little weaker in that time frame. So not to my knowledge. I'd have to do some thinking about where you would find those sources, but I was absolutely trying to pair those conversations and those struggles side by side, and to think about the ways that that struggle extended far later than 1920 for African American and Native American women. You know, 1965 and the Equal Rights Voting Act is within living memory. You know, and even so, you know, that story extends so much further beyond 1920.
Right, thank you. Chris is asking, how do you begin? Are you looking at materials by period, for example, and noticing something that leads you forward, or do you have someone specific you are looking for and then proceed from there?
I think it kind of depends on what piqued your interest. I think both are absolutely valid. Much of what I highlighted today is stuff that I stumbled across and that I then saved and thought about a lot. You know, like I have a whole folder of just like things to come back to. You know, so a lot of it for me is that experience of something comes across your desk for another reason, or you're looking for something else and you see something. You know, like I first came across those hand cutouts working on an entirely different project, but it was that thing that catches your breath and you're like, wait a second, what does that mean? And then it kind of leads you down the rabbit hole to look for all those different things. But other people come at it from the other angle. You know, I'm really interested in this one person and her experience, and then you go from there. So I think either one kind of leads you in a different direction to the same result. So yeah, I think they're both great.
Rex is asking, in terms of the mother's hands supporting the children in their photos, we might compare photos of today, for example, in social media or family photo albums, which often do not feature the taker of the photograph, a mother or spouse, reflecting on roles and who is doing the work of living.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really one of the reasons why I wanted to end by saying, make sure you're in the photo, you know, because there is something about like the emotional labor of trying to capture that moment and telling that story. And that's part of what we're going to be talking about in 2 weeks is the very powerful way that women have driven the collections themselves, and how you might not be the one writing the letter, but you were the one who saved it. And what does that mean? And what is your role in that space? And there's something kind of protective about being the one behind the camera, where you don't have to see yourself and kind of have that reckoning and whatnot. So I think there's kind of a push and a pull effect. But yeah, you know, absolutely, you know, who's taking the picture, who's saving the photo, who's printing them out, who's passing them on. That's a huge part of the story when we think about what an archive is and how women participate in it.
Definitely. I see in the chat there's a question from Jennifer. asking, how do you preserve such mixed media letter inserts, such as the fabric, dried flowers, paper hands, etc.?
Yeah, we're lucky that we have an amazing conservator who partners with us, that we can come to her like, what do we do with this? And she can take a look at it and assess it and, figure it out. My favorite one was a dried strawberry that a Civil War soldier, sent home. Like, what do you do with a dried strawberry that was enclosed in a letter? Like, that enclosure matters, but you also don't want it, molding and affecting things. So we're lucky that we have a conservator who helps us figure that out. Oftentimes it's kind of like assessing, can we put that in a little envelope, and you describe on the envelope what it is, and you can pull it out and see it, but it gets clipped to the letter so that the kind of intellectual integrity is still there, but the materials themselves are protected against each other. So it's kind of a case-by-case basis, for sure.
But my understanding is that the item would still be with those letters, right?
Yeah, when we can, if it's really bulky and if that would prove a hazard to the flat paper materials, then we can always attach a note saying, this is where the thing is, see that, and you just make sure that it's intellectually linked if it's unsafe for whatever reason to keep it with the item itself.
Right, thank you. Christina is asking, do you have any research tips for uncovering women in the archival records, given the gaps you noted in the finding aids and search terms?
I think, so for me, the big takeaway is keep trying. Don't accept that 0 results means there's nothing there. It means thinking very strategically about the terms that you use, doing multiple searches. Women didn't lead anything, but maybe wife does, or maybe mother does. And so kind of searching again and again to look for those hits to try to see what kind of stuff is there. With the published stuff in the catalog, if you know kind of what field you're looking in, rely on the bibliographies, rely on the secondary sources of the people who have done the decades of work, like thinking about women in the cartography. I looked at those bibliographies and then I searched all of those names in the catalog to see what would come up. So sometimes you just have to do a little backward work. And then, don't be afraid to reach out to the curators. That's something that I always want to say is ask the questions, reach out to the people who work here, because we might know, or we might have that thing that might be hard to find, but we came across it and we love it and we want to tell people about it. So ask the curator, ask the librarian, reach out and see what they say. So find the archive that seems like it would have something, and then ask them if anything comes to mind, because sometimes they'll lead you in the right direction.
Thank you. I noticed that Christina also sent you and I a chat that mentions that Elizabeth Cady Stanton could not have been as productive a writer as she was without Susan B. Anthony's help watching her children, according to a history that she's read. So it's another example of women helping each other get it all done.
Yeah, like that's real, right?
Yes, exactly. Let's see. Cheryl, I'm not sure this is a question, but more of a comment. She's mentioning that she's been working on the 19th century Sunday school movement, and a large number of the books have drawings as well as efforts to write. These children's books are rich with additions.
I love them.
Right, exactly. I have a book with small hair bracelets and the names of the children. The drawings include pictures of specific people and also pets and homes. While we tend not to want children to write in books, it is still illustrative.
It's one of my favorite things, and I really want to do something more. But yes, children's drawings, the annotations they put in books, those moments where you can kind of really feel them, I think there's such tenderness and humanity in that moment that I think is just incredible. And there's a lot that they say too, like, how is the figure clothed? What are they doing? Why there? That they're beautiful just for what they are, but they do also have research potential. You kind of think about those children, you know, as people in a historical moment too. What does that edition say about where they were in time? Yeah, and I think that's great. And if you can send me a photo, I really want to see those little bracelets with their names. That's really great.
Yeah, it's so great, and it's a good reminder too that sometimes in our day to day we get upset about things like that,
Yeah.
but then if we're looking at something that was produced 100 years ago, we're excited. So it's hard to you know, come to terms with it sometimes, isn't it? So Rex had pointed out earlier that both you and I chose our suffragette purple. I was like, oh, what can I wear that fits with our women's rights and women's history talk? And you and I definitely chose the same thing. um, okay, so I think that's all of the questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And please join us again next week. We really appreciated having you here. And thanks so much. Have a great evening.